What's up, YouTube? Today I'm going to be going over how to use Radeon software to maximize the performance of your Radeon card. This is going to be true for the RX 480, 580, 5700 XT, 6800, Vega, basically anything that uses the Radeon software. So I'm going to press Alt R while I'm in game, or I can come out of game and then I can type over here Radeon software and it'll show me this. In game, I want to be able to see FPS. If I have the game selected, it might show it up here in my overlay, which I can enable by pressing Control Shift O. Or I can see it over here as well. Settings, general. Metrics overlay. Transparency, I can turn this transparency down as well, turn it up, make it bigger. Let's see, what if I make this a little bit bigger? That's huge. Alright, well, what I'm going to do in Radeon software is I'm going to go to Performance, I'm going to go to Tuning. Here's global tuning. This means that it affects all games. It affects everything. Now you can do that and it'll apply to all games, but what you find is stable for one game might not be stable for another game. So what I recommend is set this for the particular game. I'm going to turn my power limit all the way up so it can draw more power if it needs to. And I'm going to start increasing this max frequency until it crashes. And then I'm going to bring it back down. Either it crashes or until my performance drops. Right now you see I've got it locked at 60. But you'd raise it until it crashes or the performance gets worse. Now, because I have it locked to 60, none of this is really going to make any difference. Unless I'm doing something in game that drops below 60. But if I just go back to the game, I go to my system and settings, and I set this VSync off, set this to higher than whatever it sits at. I'll just set it to, if you can set it to unlimited, set it to unlimited. If you can't, just set it to whatever the max is. Okay. Now I can see it's doing about 85, 84. Open my Radeon software back up. Okay. Now when I start to change this stuff, it may affect that. Though I will tell you, and so if you're running this this card and software combination,
No more.
I've found that none of these settings have made really any difference to me since updating to 21.2.2, which is the second release in February in the year 2021 of Radeon software. So nothing I change right now is going to make a difference, but this will work for you while you're doing it. I'm going to set this max frequency higher and higher, incrementally by maybe 50, by 10, whatever you choose to go by. So I could increase it to 2310 and then apply changes. Set it to 2320 and apply changes until the performance either gets worse or it crashes. But this is important. I want my power limit and my voltage to be all the way up. The reason for that is, even if I continue to set this higher, if my power limit, if my card has already reached power limit or has reached max voltage, it won't go any higher or it'll crash. So I set these to max and I start to move this up. And I move it up, move it up, move it up until I find the maximum that it'll reach without diminishing performance or crashing. And then I might even bring it down just a little bit to be safe. Then I'm going to start to set my voltage back down further and further and further. I know that I could set this to 950 without it crashing anywhere ever. So I just set mine to 950. But you'll find at a minimum value, it'll eventually crash because it can't sustain that frequency. And so you bring it back up, until it no longer crashes. Okay. I'll do the same thing with my VRAM tuning. I can turn this up further and further from 100% or from 2000 megahertz up further and further and further until either the performance gets worse or the card crashes. And then I'll apply changes. Well, I apply changes with each step. Okay, now one thing you might find is while trying to run this max performance like I did in my RX 480 reference card, which is known to be a bit of a hotbox, that the temperatures would get a little too high. So you can try to battle this using fan control. So you'd open up fan tuning, this card in particular, and even a Red Dragon 5700 XC, for example, that has two VBIOSes. Has one that's called Silent, one that's called OC. They each have different settings, and the Silent has a 0 RPM fan setting for a particular temperature range. This does as well, this 6800. You can see before, whatever this temperature is, higher than 50, less than 70 in here. It doesn't run any fan speed. Anything below this, I want to say it's like 55 or something. Below this, it doesn't run any fan speed. Your card may not be this way. In any case, what you would try to do is set all of these to just one value. For example, like this. And then you would find that the GPU fan might get too loud, or the card might get too hot, depending on whether this is too high or too low. So if I set this high, and then I'm like, that's too loud, I'm going to drag them down with the highest one so that it affects all of them until I find a reasonable noise level. Whoops. Until I find a reasonable noise level. And once I find that reasonable, like the loudest I'm willing to accept while I'm gaming for it to be running consistently, that's where I'm going to set not my highest one, but the highest point where I want it to be. So say if I wanted it to stay at 90 or below, if I found that 65%, for example, was the most noise I'm willing to tolerate, I'd set it to 65, and the highest temperature I'm willing to tolerate is 90. I'd set this to 90. Okay. Beyond that, at the risk of my ears and a little bit of discomfort, I'm going to set it at the maximum temperature. Oh, sorry. I'm going to set it at max. So this I said was 65, and this I said was 90 degrees. So at the highest temperature that I want it to reach, I'm going to have it at that highest noise level that I'm willing to tolerate consistently. Beyond that, I'm going to set it to 100. Because I'd rather it save my card and let me know by getting super loud that it's overheating than to, stay consistently at that noise level but overheating. Okay, and then anything before that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose a temperature that I don't care about. Okay, something like 70 degrees. Like below 70 degrees, I really don't care what it does. And so what I do is I'd set this one to 70 degrees and I'd set it to the minimum that it'll allow me to. And I'd apply changes. Okay, so that's basically what I want. But something can happen. What can happen is because this isn't totally smooth, well, I mean, it looks smooth here in the graph, but it's not really smooth in how it operates. What could actually happen is you'll hear the fan be really quiet and then all of a sudden kick up and then drop back down, and then kick up and then drop back down. So what I can do is I can put a midpoint here. That means I set this one over here at 70, and then I can say, okay, well, now I can more finely tune how it changes from here to here and here to there. Even if I just want it to be linear, I just put a point in between. And if that does not suffice, then I would do basically the exact same thing, but with an extra point. And I'd say this one at 70 degrees, and I want it to be the minimum, and then I want the other ones to go up sort of linearly. And then I would apply changes. Okay, but if I were to find that it still gets too loud, or it gets too hot, or it's constantly going into that peaked side where it runs up to like 100% fan speed to try to save my card, what I'm going to do is actually lower my power limit. Because that's what allows it to get that hot in the first place. It's what allows it to try to perform that high, but it also allows it to get that hot. So what I'm going to do is just turn this down incrementally, and I could try like 10. In my case, it's the highest I could go is 15, and the lowest I can go is -8%. So I would try 10, for example, and I'd say like, oh, okay, those temps are more reasonable, and it stays exactly where I want it to. That's fine. Or I could find out it's actually a little cooler or a little quieter than what I'm willing to tolerate, so I can bring it back up, and I can continue to do that until I find a level that I find is suitable for me, acceptable. And the last little bit of it is minimum frequency. So the minimum frequency is important in that you might be in a game where your card is not really maxed out or is running consistently high. Like let's say you're consistently running 100 FPS or something like that. And then you get random dips to like 50. Well, this may be in-game, but it may not be. It may be a direct reflection of the drop in frequency. If I were to set this to a minimum of 500, whenever the card is not doing anything super hard, it will try to drop down to as low as it can. It'll only run as high as it needs to. But if I keep seeing these frame dips, what I can do is I can set this higher so that it doesn't drop below a certain frequency. And I could set this to 2200, this is 2300, so that they're really, really close. If you still get frame dips, then it's not because of your minimum frequency. It is because of something else, whether you have another bottleneck or it's the game itself. But this will at least get rid of it being caused by this driver. Okay, so after all that stuff, I've got another bit that I would like to include here, which is hardware info monitor. Okay, hardware info monitor just gives you temperatures and metrics, all sorts of values for your computer. So here I can see, say I can't get full utilization of the card, and this 99% number up here doesn't mean almost anything really. Because even if I cap this at 60 FPS, that's going to say 99. This GPU power is really more indicative of how much of the card you're using. So, right here, I'm going to look at my cores, and I'm going to see what the frequencies are. And I'm seeing that, I know I've got mine set to 4100 megahertz. These are 4100. That's what I'm allowing it to go to. And this one's at 26, this one's at 14, 13, 1800, and so on. So none of the cores are maxed out. None of the CPU cores are maxed out. The CPU temperature is low enough that it's not throttling. It's only 60 degrees right now. Just a little longer. My VRMs are a reasonable temperature for cheap boards like this one. Typically, I'd like to keep this under 80. And on a good like X570 board, you can probably safely run up to 100 or 100. I think they have a max limit of like 120 or something like that. Okay, but you still want to keep them as low as you can. And then I'd also look at my drive temperatures. If these get super hot, they will perform worse. These read and write speeds, for whatever reason, it doesn't tell me anything. Okay, here's my GPU temperature. There are two temperatures, right, in this card, and some cards won't tell you this. It'll just have one listed, and that's going to be the average. Well, you have an average, and you have a junction, which is the hot spot. So my average right here is 68, and you'll see what the maximum was. Here's the maximum. Here's what it's currently running. Here's what the minimum was since you started reading. And I can reset this so that it starts reading from now. So I'm going to look at my maximum to see if it reaches any dangerous temperatures. And I'm also going to look at what it's running now. So even though my GPU temperature I know is well below the 90 degrees or whatever that AMD says is max, and my GPU hotspot, that's the junction temperature right here, hasn't hit anything higher than 82. And that's well below the 110 degrees that AMD says is max. But I also want to take a look at my VRMs, my GPU VRMs, as well as my GPU memory. This is the VRAM. So I don't want any of those to get super hot. And if any of them do, even though everything else is operating well, that might actually be what's limiting my performance. Okay, to balance out your noise, if your GPU is really loud and your case fans are not, well, I guess I should say more specifically, if your GPU is louder than your case fans and your GPU is like as loud as as you can set it without it annoying you. For example, if 1650 is annoying me, then I should turn my case fans up to see if that helps. You would have to do that in BIOS. You restart your computer, you tap delete like your life depends on it, and then your BIOS would open and you change your fan tuning. And it's different for every motherboard, but you would look at what your CPU fan is, your case fan is in here. So I can look for it up here. Where is it? Here it is. System fan. And I'd say, okay, while it's running at these settings, and you can set a case fan to run a certain RPM depending on whether it's CPU temperature or system temperature or anything else that your BIOS will allow you to. I set it to CPU. So depending on my CPU temperature, this will be a certain RPM. This case fan will go to a certain speed.
Just a little longer.
So I see that while I'm running this game, it runs 60 degrees. So at 60 degrees, if the case fan is lower, quieter than the GPU, I will turn this up to a value that I find is reasonable. So I would just, similarly to how we did this, fan tuning, I'd say, well, 60 degrees, I would do the same thing. I'd move them around, apply changes in BIOS, and then like I'd hear the case fans going, and then I'd bring it down, bring it down, bring it down, until I find a volume that's similar to what the GPU is running in game. And then the 60 degree one is the one that I'd set at that value, and then I'd bring my lower ones, of course, down. And I'd bring my higher ones up, and I'd say maybe my case fans, I want them to never be above whatever noise level. I could say like that is a noise level that I'm willing to accept. I set them to the highest, and I apply changes, and then I start to drag them down until I find whatever the loudest for my case fans I will tolerate is. My highest one I will still set it to max, just like I did for the GPU. And I could say like for 90 degrees. I don't want my CPU to get higher than 90. If my CPU is at 90 degrees, I want my case fans to run at max, for example. And then at 60 degrees, I want it to run at whatever the noise level I found was, like this particular RPM. And then I would bring the ones before that down accordingly. And beyond that, change those accordingly as well.
No one's home.
So I would see that for my case fans, and I try to balance them out as best as possible because, like I said, if your case fans are super loud and your GPU is not, then you could turn your case fans down and still get maybe the same temperatures without as much noise. So it's really a balancing act of getting your case fans to be as loud as your GPU fan and as loud as your CPU fan, while all of them being at reasonable temperatures. Okay, another thing I can do is I can Alt-Control-Delete to look for any bottlenecks. So you, in the event that you're wondering to yourself if you need to upgrade your GPU to get better game performance, that may be the case, it may not be the case, but you need to check either here to see whether the CPU cores are maxed out, any of them, really any of them. If a single core is maxed out, you're gonna bottleneck likely. If any of your temperatures are too high, it's gonna throttle. And so you would check your temperatures, check your speeds, and then you're going to check over here as well to see if your memory or your CPU or anything else like that. So you can see the CPU core speed here as well in Task Manager. You go to Performance, you click whatever it is you want to evaluate, you hit Open Resource Monitor, and like here, see, I can see CPU, I can see memory, I can see disk, and I can see network. Okay, so if I scroll down there, here on the right hand side, you can see my individual core speeds. And you see that none of them are really maxed out. Memory, I can see the same thing. Disk. This may show you some serious spikes, like for example my C drive right here. Sometimes I see it spike really high. This is queue length, which is essentially how long any particular process is having to wait. But your read and write and your total here, you can look up the specs for your drive, for whether it's like in this case I'm running Windows on an NVMe and I'm running everything else on an SSD, and you can look up the read and write speeds, and then you can check here under System just how much these things are running. So read, write, you can look at these values and see essentially what's happening, if these are running at max or not running at max. And just for reference, kilobytes are in here. Well, this says bytes per second. If it were a lowercase b, it's bits per second, which are not the same. They're 8 bytes in a bit. I mean, 8 bits in a byte. Byte is the bigger of the two. And so when you look at this, like let's say if my drive says it'll do 20 gigabytes, or let's say 2 gigabytes per second, or 2 gigabytes per second, or something like that for reading. Then I'd look at that number. Kilo is thousands, mega is millions, and then if once we get into the thousand, millions, the billions, that will be my giga. So kilo, mega, giga. So I'd have to look at the billions value for whichever one of them, if that's what my speed specifies. But you can look at either of them and see if they're maxed out. So you can use Task Manager, you can use Hardware Info Monitor, and then you can use Radeon software to tune any of this stuff according to your card. Okay. What else? Oh, one more thing. So, just in game for this. I know that I only run this on a 60 hertz TV, and you might even see some tearing and some stuttering right now, and that's because I'm doing the recording at 60 FPS, but it says it's running 89, 90, 84, bouncing around. So if your monitor is displaying 60 max, like in my case, there really isn't any reason to set it higher than that. So what I'll do is go to my settings. Sorry, I was just checking some work stuff. So I'll go to my graphics settings and I'll set this to VSync and 60. The VSync will help remove some tearing, and if my frame rate is the same as my display's frequency or frame rate, it'll look a lot smoother. So I should have less tearing and less stuttering, even though the FPS is less than it was. Another thing is, let's say you have a 144 hertz monitor and it can run 144, but your FPS is bouncing between anywhere between 60 and 144, it's gonna look pretty ugly. And the reason for that is the difference in frame rates, where like 60 consistently doesn't look so bad, but bouncing between 60 and 144 would look terrible. So you can set the maximum to just be a little bit less. Instead of 144, try 120. And I know it'll vary between those two, but the difference between them will be less, and so it may be less noticeable. And if that's not enough, try 100, try 90, try 80. Try values that are closer, and then you might find that it looks a lot smoother. But don't take my word for it, just try it out. In any case, I've got it locked to 60, and you can see it says, in some cases, it says as much as, let's see when I look in here, 80% utilization. Which realistically, 130 watts out of what really is about 215 for this card. It's not much more than 50. 60. What is that number anyway? So we do 130 watts over 225. 58% utilization. Effectively. Even though in this game it really only hits about 180 max. 185 max. So comparing it to the max that I can hit in the game, say 130 versus 185, it's about 70%. Yeah, but sometimes you'll see that it says GPU is maxed out, but your wattage isn't really that high, which means it's not really maxed out. In any case, I know this has been a long, boring video, but I hope it's helped somebody out there tune their card. At least a little bit. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys later.